A female store owner accidentally discovered a homeless girl regularly rummaging through her store's trash bins for food. A few days later, the girl was terrified when she realized the woman had. The scent of warm bread and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as Vivian wiped down the glass display case, her movements practiced and unhurried. Marigold Market, her small convenience store, had been her pride and labor for nearly 15 years, a quiet refugee tucked between aging apartment buildings and the unspoken routines of everyday life. She had built this place with care, each shelf meticulously arranged, each product chosen with the understanding of what the neighborhood needed. A place where familiar faces came for their morning coffee, their forgotten dinner ingredients, or sometimes just for the warmth of a brief conversation. The wooden counter had been polished so many times it bore a permanent sheen, and the small dining section, with its 4 tables near the windows, held the gentle hum of life, the rustle of newspapers, the clinking of spoons against ceramic mugs, the occasional laughter of a customer exchanging stories with her. Vivian had never minded the predictability of it all. She had always been a woman of habit, someone who found comfort in the small rituals of daily life. The early morning stocking of shelves, the careful balancing of the register, the quiet satisfaction of making sure everything was in its place. But then, the girl arrived. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker at the corner of her vision, a movement just outside the back door, a shadow lingering near the dumpster in the evening hours. She might have dismissed it as a stray cat, but curiosity had a way of settling deep in her bones. By the 3rd evening, she saw her clearly. A girl, no older than 9, her thin frame swallowed by a jacket far too large for her, hair tangled and falling into her eyes. She never approached the store, never begged, never even looked toward the customers coming and going. Instead, she moved with quiet precision, waiting until the last of the kitchen scraps were thrown out before carefully sifting through them. Vivian found herself watching longer than she intended, her hands stilling against the counter as the girl picked up half a sandwich someone had discarded, examining it as though it were gold before tucking it into a worn canvas bag. That was the first time something in Vivian twisted, not just pity, but recognition. She had seen hunger before. She had grown up in a house where meals were sometimes counted, where bills were always one step ahead of the money coming in. She had known what it was like to go without, to sit at school while her stomach ached, to pretend she wasn't hungry when others ate around her, but she had never had to dig through garbage to survive. Viv, that kid again? The voice belonged to Mrs. Carter, a regular who had been coming to Marigold Market for years, always with the same sharp observations and strong opinions. She sat at the counter, stirring her tea in slow, deliberate circles. Vivian hesitated, glancing out the window where the girl had already disappeared into the dusk. "Yeah," she murmured. Mrs. Carter sighed. "Poor thing. Can't be safe, a kid wandering like that. Somebody ought to call someone." Vivian didn't respond. She had thought about it, about stepping outside, about asking the girl her name, about calling someone. But something stopped her. There was a wariness in the girl's posture, a quiet, guarded distance. If Vivian moved too quickly, she might disappear entirely, like a frightened bird startled from a branch. So she did nothing. For 6 days, she simply watched. Every evening, at nearly the same time, the girl came. She never took more than what she needed. She never lingered. And on the 7th evening, Vivian made a decision. The store had closed for the night, the last of the customers long gone. The streetlights flickered dimly outside, casting long shadows across the pavement. Vivian moved with quiet purpose, selecting a small sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water from the stockroom. Of course it is new, within the expiry date, quality guaranteed. Instead of tossing them with the usual waste, she carefully placed them at the very edge of the dumpster, close enough to be seen but not so obviously left out that it would feel like charity. Then, she stepped back. She didn't stay to watch, Some things needed to happen unseen. The next night, she did it again, and the next. On the fourth night, she allowed herself to watch from the side window, her breath slow, her pulse unexpectedly steady. The girl approached, her usual hesitation flickering in the dim light. But then, for the first time, she noticed the food had been deliberately placed, not simply discarded. She hesitated, eyes darting left and right, searching for who had done this. Vivian held her breath. The girl reached out, her thin fingers grazing the sandwich before she picked it up, not with the frantic desperation of someone stealing, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had never been given something freely. She stood there for a long moment, her small hands tightening around the apple as if testing its weight. Then, slowly, cautiously, she tucked the items into her bag. And for the first time, she didn't look afraid. The evening stretched long and quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator cases filling the empty spaces in Marigold Market. Outside, the sky had darkened to an inky blue, the last traces of daylight fading behind the buildings. The usual rhythm of the store continued. Customers trickled in and out, the scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air, and from the small dining area, the occasional clatter of utensils against plates echoed in the stillness. Vivian wiped her hands on a dish towel, her eyes drifting toward the back door for what felt like the 100th time that evening. 3 days. It had been 3 days since she had last seen Wendy. The girl had never skipped a night before. For an entire week, Wendy had come at the same time, her movements careful but assured, taking only what she needed. But now, the alleyway remained empty. The food Vivian had left on the second night had still been there the next morning, untouched. That was when the unease had settled deep in her chest, refusing to leave. She told herself not to dwell on it. Maybe Wendy had found another place, another source of food. Maybe she had moved on. But then why did it feel so wrong? Viv? The voice pulled her back. She turned to see Lucas, the college kid who worked the evening shift, leaning against the counter with an easy stance, though his eyes were sharp with curiosity. "You've been watching the back door all night," he said, flicking a glance toward the alley. "What's going on?" Vivian hesitated. Lucas had been working here long enough to notice things, but he wasn't the type to pry unless he had reason to. With a quiet sigh, she set the towel down and met his gaze. "There's a girl," she said. "Wendy. She usually comes by at night to take the food I leave out." Lucas tilted his head. "The kid in the oversized jacket?" Vivian nodded. "She hasn't shown up in 3 days," she added, her voice softer now. "It's not like her." Lucas was silent for a moment before offering a small shrug. "Maybe she found somewhere better." "Maybe," Vivian murmured, but it felt more like an attempt to convince herself than an answer. Her eyes flicked back toward the glass panel of the back door, the dim alley stretching beyond. The streetlight overhead flickered once, casting long shadows against the brick wall. Then, movement. Vivian stiffened. A small figure slipped into view, hunched against the cold, moving with hesitant, deliberate steps. Wendy. Relief flickered in Vivian's chest. She was okay. But then she noticed something was wrong. Wendy wasn't acting like herself. Every other night, the girl had moved with quiet efficiency, scanning what had been left out, choosing carefully. But tonight, there was no pause, no hesitation. Wendy Orr reached straight for one thing. A carton of milk. Nothing else. She didn't even glance at the sandwich. Vivian's grip tightened around the edge of the counter. This wasn't normal. She waited, expecting Wendy to reach for something more. An apple, a piece of bread, anything to sustain her. But the girl only clutched the milk to her chest and turned on her heel, slipping back toward the alley's shadows. Vivian felt a cold unease settle deep in her bones. Something had changed. She wasn't making a choice. She was desperate. Vivian didn't think. She moved. Her feet carried her to the back door before she could second-guess herself, her fingers wrapping around the handle. Viv? Lucas's voice barely registered, but she caught the note of confusion in it. She ignored him. The air outside was sharp with the bite of approaching winter. Wendy's form was already shrinking in the distance, her steps quick but unsteady. Vivian stepped outside. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of an unspoken boundary hovering in the air between them. She had spent over a week keeping her distance, letting Wendy dictate the silent rules of their unspoken arrangement. But now, those rules had changed. She took a breath, and then she followed. The wind howled through the narrow streets, slipping between the cracks of old buildings, whispering against the damp pavement. Vivian followed at a steady pace, her breath shallow, her heartbeat heavy, her boots barely making a sound as she trailed Wendy from a safe distance. The girl didn't look back. She moved quickly, weaving through alleyways, slipping into the shadows like she had done it 100 times before. The way her shoulders hunched, the way she clutched the carton of milk so tightly against her chest. It was as if that single item was all that mattered, as if it held the weight of something more than just hunger. Vivian's stomach clenched. The city was eerily silent in these forgotten corners. The roads were empty, only the occasional hum of a distant car reminding her that the world still existed beyond these streets. This wasn't a place people lingered. It was a place they passed through quickly, keeping their heads down, pretending not to see. Wendy finally stopped. Vivian pressed herself against the rough brick wall of a nearby building, watching as the girl approached an abandoned structure, its windows broken, its door barely hanging on rusted hinges. A single flickering street lamp cast a dim glow across the crumbling entrance. Vivian's breath misted in the air as she edged closer. Wendy disappeared inside. For a moment, Vivian hesitated, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. This was it, the line between keeping her distance and stepping in. She had spent over a week letting Wendy dictate the terms of their unspoken arrangement. But that had changed the moment the girl had taken nothing but milk. Vivian moved forward. The inside of the building smelled of damp wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, rust maybe, or the lingering scent of something long decayed. The air was thick with the stillness of forgotten places, the kind that made her skin prickle. Then she saw him. A small boy, no older than 5, curled up on the floor, his tiny body shivering despite the heavy layers of clothing draped over him. His face was pale, his lips cracked, his breath uneven. He didn't move. Vivian's chest tightened. Wendy was already kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she unscrewed the cap on the milk carton. She tilted it toward his lips, whispering his name so softly that it barely reached Vivian's ears. Sean. Vivian stepped forward. At the sound of her movement, Wendy's head snapped up. She moved instantly, her body shielding the boy, her eyes wide with a fear so sharp it made Vivian stop in her tracks. She had seen that look before, on stray animals cornered in alleyways, on people who had learned that trusting the wrong person meant losing everything. Vivian raised both hands slightly, her voice calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Wendy didn't relax. Vivian let out a slow breath, her gaze shifting back to the boy. "He's sick," she said, her voice softer now. "I can see it from here." Wendy's fingers curled around Sean's arm. She didn't answer. Vivian crouched down, keeping her movements slow and careful. The air inside the building was frigid, and Sean's skin was too pale, too still. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "What's his name?" Wendy hesitated. Then, voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Sean. And I'm Wendy." The way she said it. Like their name was something fragile, something that could break if spoken too loudly. Made Vivian's heart ache. She nodded. "Okay," she said, shifting the coat from her shoulders. "Here." Wendy flinched when she moved, but when Vivian carefully draped the coat over Sean's small frame, she didn't stop her. Vivian pressed the back of her hand against his forehead, burning hot. "He needs help," she said, her voice careful, measured. "He's not going to get better here." Wendy's grip on Sean's sleeve tightened. "No hospitals," she whispered. Vivian met her gaze. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper. Wendy wasn't just afraid for Sean. She was afraid of what would happen to them if they stepped into a place with rules, with people who had the power to take them away from each other. Vivian let the silence stretch, letting Wendy breathe through her fear before speaking again. "Then let me take him somewhere warm," she said. "No doctors, no police, just warmth, food, a safe place for tonight." Wendy's shoulders shook, her breath uneven. Vivian watched as her eyes flickered to Sean as she studied the way his fingers barely twitched against the fabric of his oversized sweater. She was losing him, and she knew it. For a long moment, Wendy didn't move. Then, slowly, painfully, she nodded. The hospital was colder than Vivian expected, the artificial glow of fluorescent lights casting stark shadows along the tiled floor. The quiet hum of medical equipment, the occasional beeping of monitors, and the soft murmur of nurses moving from room to room filled the space, an unfamiliar contrast to the warmth of Marigold Market. She sat stiffly in a plastic chair, her fingers curled around the fabric of her sweater, watching the door to Sean's examination room. Beside her, Wendy barely moved. She sat on the very edge of her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her entire body was tense, as if the moment she let her guard down, something terrible would happen. Her wide eyes darted to every passing doctor, to the flickering overhead light, to the clipboard clutched in a nurse's hands. Vivian could see it, the way Wendy was bracing herself, waiting for someone to step forward and take her brother away. Vivian exhaled slowly. "He's in good hands," she said, keeping her voice quiet, careful. Wendy didn't look at her. Her fingers twisted into the hem of her oversized jacket. "They're gonna ask questions," she whispered, barely audible. Vivian's chest tightened. She recognized the fear in Wendy's voice, the way she was preparing for the worst. Not for herself, but for Sean. "They're going to take him somewhere," Wendy continued, her voice trembling. "And then I won't—" She stopped herself. Vivian's heart ached at the words Wendy couldn't say. The girl wasn't afraid of hospitals. She wasn't afraid of doctors. She was afraid of being separated. Vivian didn't answer right away. She needed Wendy to believe her, to trust that she wasn't walking them into something worse. "No one's taking him away," she said finally, her tone steady and sure. "I promise." For the first time since they arrived, Wendy looked at her. There was something raw in her gaze, something desperate, something that said she wanted to believe Vivian, but had spent too long learning not to. Before either of them could speak, a nurse pushed open the door to the examination room. Vivian stood immediately, instinctively stepping between Wendy and the approaching figure. The nurse gave them a tired but kind smile. "Sean is stable for now," she said. "His fever is still high, but the IV fluids should help. We'll keep him overnight for observation." Wendy's breath hitched, her hands clenching into fists. Vivian stepped closer, her presence a quiet reassurance. "Can I see him?" Wendy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. Wendy hesitated, only for a moment, before rushing inside. Vivian followed slowly, standing by the doorway as Wendy made her way to the hospital bed. Sean looked even smaller under the crisp white blankets, his face still too pale, but his breathing was deeper now, more even. An IV was taped to the inside of his wrist, his tiny fingers curled loosely over the edge of the blanket. Wendy didn't cry. She just reached out and took his hand, gripping it tightly, as if she could keep him anchored to her just by holding on. Vivian exhaled, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. They had made it through the night, but she knew it wasn't over. She glanced back toward the hallway, her mind already racing ahead to what would come next. The hospital would ask questions. people would start to notice, and sooner or later, Wendy and Sean would be on someone's radar. She couldn't let that happen. She looked back at Wendy, watching as the girl stroked her brother's hair, as she whispered something too soft for Vivian to hear. She had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Vivian took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Wendy," she said gently. The girl tensed but didn't look away from Sean. Vivian crouched beside her, keeping her voice soft. "I know you don't want to stay here," she said, "and I know you don't trust me yet. But when they let Sean go..." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I want you both to come home with me." Wendy's breath caught. She turned, her expression unreadable. Vivian held her gaze, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, slowly, carefully, Wendy nodded. Meanwhile, the soft buzz of streetlights hummed against the rain-slick pavement as Samuel pulled into the empty parking lot of Marigold Market. Something was wrong. He knew it the second he stepped out of his car. The store was dark, but not locked. His jaw tightened as he reached for the handle, pushing the door open with a slow creak. Inside, the store was exactly as it should be, register closed, shelves neatly stocked, the scent of coffee still faintly lingering in the air. But the fact that Vivian wasn't here, that she had left without locking the door, told him everything he needed to know. Something had happened. The car rumbled quietly as Vivian pulled into the driveway, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. The streets had been quiet on the drive home, the rain leaving dark streaks on the windshield, the wipers swiping in steady rhythm. Wendy sat in the passenger seat, her body rigid, her fingers gripping the edge of her sleeves. In the back seat, Sean was still asleep, bundled in a blanket the hospital had given them, his tiny frame lost in its folds. His fever had gone down, but he was still weak, too weak. Vivian shut off the engine, exhaling softly before turning to Wendy. "We're here," she said gently. Wendy didn't move. She stared at the house, a modest two-story home with warm porch lights flickering against the damp night air. To any passerby, it would look ordinary, safe, and welcoming. But Vivian could see it in Wendy's eyes. To her, it was foreign, unknown, a place she couldn't yet trust. "Come on, sweetheart," Vivian urged softly. Slowly, Wendy nodded. She reached for the door handle but froze when the front door of the house swung open. Samuel stood in the doorway. Vivian had expected him to be worried. She had expected him to be confused. But the sharp crease between his brows, the way his shoulders squared, and the way his gaze instantly found hers, told her he had been waiting. She swallowed. Samuel had always been steady, a man who observed first, questioned later. But right now, his police instincts were in full force. His gaze flickered to the car, landing on Wendy first. His frown deepened. Then he saw Sean. Vivian barely had time to unbuckle her seatbelt before Samuel stepped forward. "Viv," he said, his voice controlled, but firm. "What's going on?" Wendy stiffened instantly. Her hand shot out, gripping Sean's blanket-covered arm, her small body shifting instinctively in front of him. The motion was immediate, defensive, and protective. Vivian's heart twisted. She had been so focused on getting them somewhere safe that she hadn't thought about this moment, the moment Wendy would see Samuel not as a husband, not as a kind man, but as a police officer, and she was terrified of him. Samuel must have noticed it too, because his expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his face as Wendy clutched onto Sean like he might be ripped from her arms. Vivian moved quickly, stepping between them before Samuel could say anything else. "Wendy, sweetheart," she said softly, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "It's okay. You're safe here. No one is going to take you anywhere." Wendy didn't relax. Her eyes darted to Samuel's uniform, the badge, the holster on his hip, the authority that came with his stance. Samuel saw it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then slowly, he crouched down too, lowering himself to Wendy's level. His voice, when he spoke, was calmer. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said simply. Wendy didn't move. Her fingers were still wrapped tightly around Sean's blanket, her body still positioned between them. Vivian reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Samuel won't take you away, sweetheart," she reassured her. "He's a good man. He just wants to help." A long silence stretched between them. Samuel waited. He didn't push, didn't demand answers. He just knelt there, watching as Wendy processed his presence, as she fought the instinct to run. Finally, her shoulders dropped, just slightly. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she didn't bolt either. Vivian exhaled. "Let's get inside, okay?" "It's warm." Slowly, Wendy nodded. She let go of the blanket, just enough to help Vivian lift Sean from the back seat. Samuel stepped back, giving them space as they carried the boy inside. The house was warm, the soft glow of the living room lamps casting golden light against the wooden floors. Wendy hesitated at the doorway, her fingers brushing against the frame like she needed to make sure it was real. Inside, Vivian gently placed Sean on the couch, adjusting the blankets around him. Samuel watched, his arms crossed, his mind clearly working through what he was seeing. Finally, he turned to Wendy. "Can you tell me where your parents are?" Silence. Wendy's gaze dropped to the floor. Her small fingers twisted into the fabric of her jacket, the threadbare edges fraying against her touch. Vivian waited. She could see the battle happening behind Wendy's eyes, the instinct to lie, to protect, to stay silent. Then finally, her lips parted. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "They're gone," she said. A pause. Then, a truth that had been sitting heavy in her chest for far too long. "They died," she murmured. "In a fire." The room fell silent. Vivian's breath hitched. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. For the first time since she had met her, Wendy wasn't just surviving. She was grieving. The house was quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that comes with the weight of exhaustion. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, streaking the kitchen window in thin, lazy trails. Vivian stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, the warm scent of cinnamon filling the air. She moved carefully, mindful of the small presence behind her. Sean sat at the table, his small frame wrapped in a thick sweater, his fingers curled around a steaming mug of hot chocolate. He was still pale, still weak, but he was awake, his wide eyes flickering across the kitchen as if trying to understand where he was. Across from him, Wendy sat stiff-backed in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching. She hadn't spoken much since last night, not since she had uttered those words. They died in a fire. Vivian ladled oatmeal into bowls and set them in front of the children, but Wendy didn't touch hers. "You don't have to eat if you're not ready," Vivian said gently, "but it's here when you want it." Sean was the first to move. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon, blowing on it carefully before taking a bite. His eyes flickered shut as the warmth spread through him. Vivian watched from the corner of her eye as Wendy's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, as if she was fighting an internal battle. After a long moment, she picked up her spoon. It wasn't much, just a single bite at first, but it was something. Vivian swallowed the relief rising in her throat. From the living room, she heard Samuel moving around, the quiet rustling of papers, the occasional tap of fingers against his phone. She didn't need to ask what he was doing. She already knew. Samuel had woken early, his mind already working through the questions that had been gnawing at him all night. A fire. A girl afraid of the police. Something didn't sit right. He sat at the dining table, his laptop open, files scattered around him. He had pulled up the official report from the fire that had taken Wendy and Sean's parents. At first glance, it looked clean, conclusive. Faulty wiring, an accidental electrical fire in an old apartment complex. But as he read further, his frown deepened. No records of compensation, no follow-up investigations. And the landlord, never even mentioned in the reports. Samuel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. This wasn't just negligence. This was a cover-up. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Vivian stood quietly by the stove, her body angled protectively toward the children. They had barely started trusting her. If Wendy found out he was digging into this, she might bolt. He needed to be careful. He needed to know the truth. Later that afternoon, Vivian found Wendy in the backyard. The rain had stopped, leaving the grass damp, the air crisp. Wendy sat on the porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the sky. Vivian stepped out, folding her arms against the chill. "Mind if I sit?" Wendy didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. Vivian took that as a yes. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the neighborhood drifted in. The distant bark of a dog, the faint murmur of a radio playing from a nearby house. "You know," Vivian said finally, "when I was younger, I hated asking for help." Wendy didn't react, but Vivian could see the slight tilt of her head. She was listening. "I thought if I let people help me, it meant I owed them something, that nothing ever came for free." Vivian exhaled. "But sometimes, people just want to help because they care." Wendy's fingers tightened against her sleeves. Vivian glanced at her, her voice soft. "That's why you're afraid of my husband, isn't it?" This time Wendy flinched. She didn't answer, but the silence spoke volumes. Vivian sighed, resting her arms on her knees. "Samuel isn't like the people you've known before," she said. "I know you don't trust him yet, but I promise you, he's not here to hurt you or Sean." Wendy stared at the ground. "He's still a cop." Vivian nodded. "Yes, he is." A beat of silence. Then, so quietly that Vivian almost didn't hear it. "Cops didn't help us before." Vivian's chest tightened. She reached over, gently tucking a strand of Wendy's hair behind her ear. "I know," she murmured, "but that doesn't mean they're all bad." For a long time, Wendy didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I just want Sean to be safe." Vivian's throat burned. "You both will be," she promised. And for the first time since she'd brought them home, Wendy didn't argue. That night, Samuel sat in his office, staring at his screen. Something wasn't right about the fire. The report was too clean, too neatly wrapped up. No landlord listed, no witness statements. The deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Then finally he found it. A buried record. A complaint made weeks before the fire, filed by multiple tenants. Electrical issues, faulty wiring. The landlord had been warned. But the records had been ignored. No follow-ups, no inspections. Samuel's pulse quickened. This wasn't an accident. Someone had covered it up. His jaw clenched. And now he was going to find out who. He finds inconsistencies in the fire reports. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the darkened kitchen. Samuel leaned over the dining table, eyes fixed on the laptop screen, his fingers tight around a steaming cup of coffee. The glow of the monitor cast sharp shadows across his face, deepening the crease between his brows. The more he read, the angrier he became. It wasn't just negligence, it was a cover-up. The fire report had gaps, no detailed account of how the blaze spread so quickly, no follow-up investigation on the faulty wiring that tenants had complained about for months. And the landlord? Conveniently absent from any official mention. Samuel's jaw clenched. No landlord gets away with something this big unless someone covers for them. And there was only one man who had the power and the greed to bury a case like this. Tyler. Samuel's hand hovered over his phone. He could call his precinct now, dig deeper. but he knew how Tyler operated. If he caught wind of this, the evidence would disappear before Samuel could get anywhere close to the truth. Samuel wasn't a reckless man. If he was going to take Tyler down, he had to be careful. Meanwhile, Wendy was adjusting, but slowly. She followed Vivian to Marigold Market most mornings, staying close but never quite at ease. She didn't speak much, didn't meet customers' eyes. But she watched. She was quietly observant, memorizing the way Vivian arranged the shelves, the way she handled deliveries, the way she always smiled at the regulars. One afternoon, as the shop slowed, Wendy found herself alone in the storage room, absent-mindedly sorting cans. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was just nice to have control over something. Vivian's voice broke the silence. "You like organizing?" Wendy tensed slightly, but she didn't stop. "It's easier when things are in order." Vivian chuckled softly, stepping inside. "I get that." For a while, neither of them spoke. Vivian knelt beside her, picking up a can of soup, placing it in the neat row Wendy had formed. "You know," Vivian said after a moment, her voice soft, "when I was a kid, my mum used to braid my hair while I did my homework. Said it helped me focus." Wendy froze. Her fingers hesitated over a can, her throat tightening. For a second, she wasn't in a storage room. She was back home, sitting cross-legged on the floor, her mother's hands moving through her tangled hair, warm and patient. "My mum used to do that too," Wendy murmured before she could stop herself. Vivian's movements stilled. She didn't press, didn't ask anything else. She just reached forward and tucked a loose strand of Wendy's hair behind her ear. "Would you like me to braid yours?" she asked gently. Wendy hesitated. The offer felt like something out of another life, but after a long moment, she nodded. Vivian moved behind her, fingers warm and gentle, untangling knots with quiet patience. There was something soothing about it, something that made Wendy's tense shoulders relax, just slightly. It wasn't trust, but it was something. That night, Samuel sat in his office, his mind racing. He had spent the last few hours digging through old complaints, missing reports, suppressed evidence, and then he found it. A buried record, weeks before the fire. A formal complaint from multiple tenants about electrical hazards. They had requested an inspection. It had never happened. Samuel scrolled further. The request had been filed, stamped, sent to the department. But then, denied. Signed off by Tyler. Samuel exhaled sharply, sitting back. His suspicion had been right. Tyler had covered for the landlord, and people had died because of it. Samuel's fingers curled into fists. He had always hated Tyler. The man was corrupt, selfish, always looking for ways to make a quick profit. But this was unforgivable. If Tyler had taken a bribe to let safety violations slide, if he had deliberately ignored a fire hazard, then he had blood on his hands. And Samuel wasn't about to let him get away with it. He stared at his laptop, at the signature on the denial form. His hands itched to call someone, to drag Tyler into a room and demand answers. But he couldn't afford to act impulsively. If he tipped his hand too soon, Tyler would bury the rest of the evidence. Number Samuel needed to be smart about this. He needed proof, real proof. He glanced towards the hallway, where the dim light from the living room cast soft shadows against the walls. Wendy and Sean were finally somewhere safe. But if Samuel didn't stop this corruption, if he didn't make sure justice was served, then what happened to them could happen to another family. He clenched his jaw. He had to take Tyler down, not just for Wendy and Sean, but for every life that had been lost because of him. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast long shadows across Samuel's office as he flipped through the fire reports once more. Every detail confirmed his worst fears. It wasn't just negligence, it was deliberate. Tyler had known about the electrical hazards. The tenants had filed complaints, official, documented requests for inspections. And yet, The inspections had never happened, because Tyler had buried them. Samuel's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the scanned records on his laptop. His signature was there. Tyler had denied the request himself. The landlord had covered up the safety violations, probably bribing city officials. But he hadn't acted alone. Tyler had taken a bribe to make sure the complaints disappeared, and because of that, people had died. Samuel reached for his phone. He couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who hadn't sold their conscience for a paycheck. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed Detective Marcus Holloway, an old friend and one of the few officers Samuel trusted completely. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Holloway, it's Samuel. I need to talk." A pause. Then, "It's about Tyler, isn't it?" Samuel clenched his jaw. "Yeah." Marcus exhaled. "I had a feeling. Meet me in an hour and bring whatever you have." Samuel nodded, even though Marcus couldn't see him. "I'll be there." He hung up, rubbing his face tiredly. This was the start of something dangerous. But there was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Wendy was adjusting, slowly. She was still quiet, still careful, but she had started watching less and doing more. At Marigold Market, she lingered behind the counter, memorizing the way Vivian handled transactions, the way she spoke to customers, how she smiled easily, how people responded to her warmth. One afternoon, as the last customer left, Vivian turned to her with a grin. "Want to try?" Wendy hesitated. "I don't know how." Vivian gestured to the register. "Then I'll teach you." For a long moment, Wendy stared at the screen, at the buttons she didn't understand, at the numbers she wasn't sure she could get right. Then, cautiously, she stepped forward. Her first attempt was awkward, pressing the wrong buttons, fumbling the receipt. Vivian didn't correct her. She just guided Wendy's hands, explaining each step, letting her learn at her own pace. By the third try, Wendy's fingers moved more confidently. By the fourth, she got it right. Vivian beamed. "Told you, you're a fast learner." Wendy glanced down, her fingers brushing against the counter. She wasn't used to compliments, but for the first time, she felt like maybe she belonged here. That night, Samuel sat in a quiet diner, his laptop open, waiting for Marcus. The door swung open, and Detective Marcus Holloway slid into the booth across from him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable as he pulled off his leather gloves. Samuel pushed a file toward him. "Read this." Marcus flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. When he reached Tyler's denied inspection order, he let out a sharp breath. "Son of a—" He cut himself off, running a hand down his face. "You're telling me Tyler ignored multiple fire hazards?" Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Ignored them? Number he was paid to ignore them." Marcus clenched his jaw. "You have proof of the bribe?" "Not yet, but I will." Marcus nodded slowly. "Even without it, this is enough to raise hell." Samuel exhaled. "We need witnesses, survivors from the fire." Marcus rubbed his chin. "That's not going to be easy. Most of them lost everything." "I know," Samuel said. "But if we find them, we have a shot at taking Tyler down." Marcus leaned back, considering. "I might know where some of them ended up." Samuel's grip tightened around his coffee mug. This was it, the beginning of the end for Tyler, and Samuel was going to make sure he burned for what he did. The morning of the takedown arrived cold and grey, the kind of day where everything felt heavier. Samuel stood outside the precinct, his breath curling in the air as he dialed Marcus. "It's time," he said, when his friend picked up. Marcus didn't ask questions. "I'll meet you at the station." Inside, the air was thick with tension. This was dangerous. Tyler wasn't just a dirty cop. He was someone with power, with people who owed him favors. But Samuel wasn't backing down. He strode through the hallways, the weight of the case file tucked under his arm. He had spent too many nights combing through evidence, Too many hours tracking down victims of the fire, people who had been ignored, dismissed, forgotten. But not anymore. Marcus was already waiting in the briefing room, his expression unreadable. Across the table, Eleanor Cruz, the former Internal Affairs investigator, sat with her arms crossed. "You ready for this?" she asked, her dark eyes sharp. Samuel nodded. "Let's bring the bastard down." Tyler's fall. The arrest happened fast. Samuel and Marcus entered Tyler's office without warning, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of unease through the department. Tyler looked up from his desk, his face hardening the moment he saw them. "Something I can help you with, boys?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Marcus shut the door behind them. "Actually, yeah. You can start by standing up." Tyler's smirk faltered, just slightly. Samuel tossed the case file onto the desk. "We have witness statements, financial records, suppressed reports. You took a bribe to ignore safety violations." Tyler's jaw twitched. "You're making a mistake, Samuel." "No, you made the mistake," Samuel shot back. "And now you're gonna pay for it." The silence was heavy, the kind that stretched long enough to let the truth sink in. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, Marcus pulled out his handcuffs. "Tyler Rodriguez, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, accepting bribes, and conspiracy to commit fraud." For the first time, Tyler's mask cracked, but it was too late. As they led him out of the building, heads turned, whispers spread. The great Tyler Rodriguez dragged out in cuffs. Samuel felt no satisfaction, only resolve. The landlord was arrested the same day. The case was officially reopened. But just as Samuel thought things were finally settling, a new problem was about to erupt. Wendy's panic. The house was warm when Samuel got home, the scent of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. It should have felt safe. But the moment he stepped into the living room, he saw Wendy frozen in the hallway, her face pale, her breathing uneven. Vivian turned from the kitchen, immediately noticing the tension in the room. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Wendy was shaking. Samuel followed her gaze. Only then did he realize his phone was still on speaker. And on the other end, Marcus's voice rang out. "We'll need child services to process the next steps. There's still a lot to figure out." Silence. Then, Wendy bolted. She was out the front door before Samuel could move, the sound of her panicked footsteps pounding against the pavement. "Wendy!" Vivian's voice cracked with alarm as she rushed after her. Samuel was right behind her, his pulse racing. Wendy ran like a wild animal caught in a trap, breath ragged, feet hitting the pavement hard. But Vivian was faster. She reached out, catching Wendy's arm, pulling her into a tight embrace before she could slip away. Wendy thrashed, panic overriding everything. "Let me go! I won't let them take Sean!" Vivian held her tighter, her voice breaking with emotion. "I promised you wouldn't be separated." The words stopped Wendy cold. Her breathing came in sharp gasps, her fingers clutching Vivian's sleeves like she was holding on for dear life. Tears welled in her eyes. "I can't lose him." Vivian pressed a hand against Wendy's back, soothing, grounding. "No one is taking you away." Behind them, Samuel stood still, watching the girl tremble in his wife's arms. He clenched his jaw, his chest tight with something he hadn't expected to feel. Resolve. He stepped forward, voice steady, firm. "No one is taking you away." The words hung in the air, a promise, a decision, a truth. And for the first time, Wendy believed it. The courtroom was silent, except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting. Samuel sat in the front row, his jaw tight, hands clasped together as the judge shuffled the papers before him. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering witnesses, building a case, making sure there were no loose ends, no way for Tyler to slip through the cracks. The prosecution had laid out the evidence clearly. The buried complaints, the financial transactions linking Tyler to the landlord, the suppressed safety reports that, if acknowledged, could have saved lives. Tyler sat at the defense table, his usual arrogance replaced with a cold, impassive stare. He wasn't smirking now. The judge cleared his throat, and the verdict came swift and sharp. Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom like a hammer striking metal. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Tyler didn't react. Not outwardly, but Samuel saw the slight twitch in his fingers, the way his jaw clenched as reality set in. There were no more bribes, no more hidden favors. For the first time, Tyler was powerless. Samuel let out a slow breath, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. It was over. Justice had been served. The fallout from Tyler's conviction spread quickly. The department was in chaos. Officers who had turned a blind eye were suddenly scrambling to distance themselves. Trust in the system was at an all-time low. Then came the unexpected meeting. Samuel had barely returned home when he got the call, a request to meet with the mayor and city officials. That's how he found himself sitting across from a long mahogany table, listening as the mayor adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "The department needs leadership," the mayor said. "We need someone to fix the damage Tyler left behind." Samuel had a sinking feeling where this was going. "We want you to take over as police chief." He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. This wasn't what he had planned. He had never cared for titles, never wanted to be tangled in politics. But he thought about Wendy and Sean, about the families who had suffered because of corruption, about the people who had lost everything while Tyler and men like him thrived. Samuel sat up straighter. "If I do this, I do it my way," he said firmly. "No politics, no favors. We clean house for real this time." The mayor nodded. "That's exactly what we need." Samuel exhaled. Looks like he had a new job. Life didn't change overnight, but for the first time, Wendy and Sean had something they never had before: stability. Wendy still took time to adjust, but small moments began to shift. She no longer hesitated before sitting at the dinner table. She no longer flinched at loud noises or kept a bag packed just in case she needed to run. Sean, still regaining his strength, had grown attached to Vivian, always curling up beside her when she read to him at night. They had a routine now: breakfast together, walks to the store, evenings spent watching old movies on the couch. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. The surprise one evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Vivian cleared her throat. "I have something to tell you all." Samuel raised a brow, setting his fork down. Wendy and Sean looked up from their plates, curious. Vivian placed a small envelope in the center of the table. Samuel immediately felt a shift in the air. "What is it?" Wendy asked warily. Vivian smiled softly. "Open it." Wendy hesitated, glancing at Samuel for reassurance before slowly reaching for the envelope. She pulled out the papers inside. Her eyes scanned the text, and then she froze. Sean leaned over. "What's it say?" Wendy's hands trembled slightly as she reread the words, her breath catching in her throat. Vivian reached across the table, squeezing Wendy's hand gently. "They're adoption papers," she whispered. Silence. For a moment, Wendy didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the papers, her chest rising and falling unevenly. "You mean?" Wendy's voice was barely above a whisper. "You want us to stay?" Vivian's eyes shimmered. "Sweetheart, you were always meant to." A tear slipped down Wendy's cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, but more followed. She had spent so long expecting to be abandoned, so long believing that nothing lasted. She had never considered this possibility, never considered that someone would choose her and Sean, not just for now, but forever. Vivian squeezed her hand again. "You don't have to say yes right away. Take your time." But Wendy was already shaking her head. She didn't need time. She threw her arms around Vivian, her body shaking with the force of emotions she had kept locked away for too long. Vivian held her, rubbing slow circles on her back, whispering, You're safe. You're home. Samuel watched them, his throat tightening. Then, suddenly, Vivian turned to him, a playful glint in her eyes. There's one more surprise. Samuel blinked. What? Vivian reached into her pocket, pulling out another envelope. She handed it to him. Confused, he opened it, eyes scanning the document inside. And then, his breath caught. He looked up, meeting Vivian's gaze. A slow smile spread across her face. Samuel, she said softly, we're going to have a baby. For the first time in a long time, Samuel was speechless. Wendy and Sean stared at Vivian in shock, and then, for the first time ever, Sean broke the silence. You mean, we're going to have a little brother or sister? Vivian laughed through the tears in her eyes. That's right. Wendy let out a half laugh, half sob, covering her mouth. Sean practically bounced in his seat. Samuel, still holding the paper, let out a slow breath before shaking his head with a small chuckle. Well, he murmured, pulling his family close, looks like we're going to need a bigger house. The evening sky stretched wide above them, painted in hues of soft lavender and gold. The air was crisp, the kind that signaled the quiet transition between autumn and winter, a reminder that change was always coming, always moving forward. Vivian stood in the backyard, watching as Wendy and Sean ran barefoot through the grass, their laughter ringing through the air. It was a sound she hadn't heard often before, not laughter without hesitation, without the undercurrent of fear or uncertainty. It was different now. They were different now. Dinner had been warm, filled with soft conversation, the kind of domestic, unhurried normalcy that still felt new to Wendy and Sean. Vivian had spent the afternoon making their favorite meal, something simple, comforting. Wendy had helped set the table, while Sean had watched eagerly from the kitchen island, swinging his legs as he waited. But it was after dinner that everything changed. Vivian had cleared her throat, a small smile playing at her lips as she reached for 2 envelopes resting beside her plate. I have something for you both, she said, sliding them across the table. Wendy's fingers hovered over the envelope, hesitating. She had learned long ago that surprises weren't always good. Go on, sweetheart, Vivian encouraged gently. Slowly, Wendy peeled open the flap, unfolding the crisp white papers inside. Her eyes moved over the words, her breath catching in her throat. Adoption papers. Her hands began to shake. Samuel spoke, his voice firm, steady. You're ours now, officially. No one will take you away. The words hit harder than Wendy had expected. She had spent so long running, so long waiting for the moment everything would be ripped away. Even after weeks in this home, in this warmth, some small part of her had still been bracing for the day it would end. But now it was real. Sean, still too young to fully understand the weight of it all, grinned wide. Does that mean we can call you Mum and Dad? Vivian's heart clenched. You can call us whatever you want, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. Sean didn't hesitate. Thanks, Mom. Vivian let out a watery laugh, reaching to ruffle his hair. But Wendy sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of the papers, her eyes unreadable. Vivian reached for her gently. Sweetheart? For a long moment, Wendy said nothing. Then, she crumpled forward, burying her face in Vivian's shoulder. Silent sobs racked her thin frame. Vivian held her tight, whispering softly, rubbing slow, soothing circles on her back. Samuel's voice, quiet but firm, broke the silence. You're home, Wendy. Wendy's fingers tightened around Vivian's shirt. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe it. The second envelope. After a while, when Wendy's breathing had calmed and Sean had curled up sleepily beside her, Vivian reached for the second envelope. There's something else, she murmured. Samuel gave her a curious look as she slid it toward him. Another surprise? Vivian smiled. You could say that. Wendy wiped her eyes, still sniffling, and Sean perked up, curiosity sparking in his sleepy gaze. Samuel opened the envelope and pulled out the paper inside. His eyes scanned the words. And then he froze. He looked up at Vivian, his expression unreadable for a moment. Vivian met his gaze, eyes twinkling. "Well?" she asked softly. Samuel let out a slow exhale, rubbing the back of his neck in disbelief. "You're pregnant?" Sean gasped. Wendy's eyes widened. Vivian nodded, her fingers lacing over her stomach. 3 months. The room fell silent. Then Sean practically jumped out of his chair. "We're going to have a baby!" Vivian laughed as he barreled into her, arms wrapping around her waist. "That's right, sweetheart." Samuel sat back, shaking his head with a stunned chuckle. "Well," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. "Looks like we're really going to need a bigger house." Wendy didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the paper in Samuel's hands, then at Vivian, then back at the paper, as if trying to piece together what this meant. Then, slowly, she reached out and placed a careful hand on Vivian's stomach. Vivian covered it with her own, warmth spreading between them. "You're going to be a big sister," Vivian whispered. Wendy's throat tightened. Family. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was real. Under the stars. Later that night, as the house settled into a quiet hum, the 4 of them stood outside beneath the vast, endless sky. Samuel had built a small fire pit in the backyard a few years ago, but tonight they didn't light it. They just stood together, breathing in the crisp night air, watching the stars shimmer above them. Vivian stood close to Samuel, his arm draped protectively around her. Wendy leaned against her side, Sean clinging to her other hand. No words were needed. The past, the fear, the loss, the uncertainty, it would always be a part of them. But tonight, it wasn't what defined them. Samuel looked down at his family. "Home," he murmured. Wendy tilted her head up at him, eyes still filled with unshed tears. But this time, they weren't tears of sorrow. She nodded once. "Yeah," she whispered. "We're home."